Thanks, I forgot.
There you go.
Justin Luong is currently a PhD student at UC Santa Cruz. He studies grassland restoration outcomes and how climate change may influence current and future restoration projects. Justin has focused on resurveying 36 restored grassland projects, ranging from Santa Barbara to Humboldt from 2019 to 2021. He has worked on understanding the role of extreme drought and local adaptations during restoration. Justin is also a director at large at the California Native Grassland Association. Welcome, Justin. Thank you for being with us tonight.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you for that great introduction. Let me just get my screen up. Oops, sorry, wrong screen. Okay, so first off, I want to thank everyone for joining us for this talk today. It looks like there's a good amount of people, almost 70, and yeah, wow, that's a lot. My talk is called Our Treasured Coastal Prairies, Ecology, Maintenance, and Restoration. And as Susan mentioned, my name is Justin Luong. I'm a PhD candidate at UC Santa Cruz. And prior to coming to do my PhD, I also worked at the Cheadle Center for Biodiversity and Ecological Restoration, where I also practiced grassland and vernal pool restoration. So California grasslands are unique and host high diversities compared to many other grasslands globally. And this is because California has such diverse topography and a unique Mediterranean climate with wet, cool winters and hot, dry summers, and an active growing season that's in the spring, unlike many other areas that have an active summer growing season. California also has expansive deserts, rolling grasslands, numerous wetlands and bodies of waters, multiple mountain ranges, and large oceanic coasts that has facilitated high rates of species diversification. Many species in California are also endemic, meaning they only occur in California and nowhere else in the world. California is also the state with the second most endangered species in the United States. California grasslands used to encompass 25% of the state's area, but now occupy less than 10%. This is especially concerning because California grasslands host 40% of all of the state's native plant species and 10% of its endangered plant species. Of the less than 10% remaining of grasslands in California, 99% of the areas have been invaded by introduced species. Before they were invaded by non-native annual grasses and forbs, a couple are pictured here on the bottom right, they primarily consisted of perennial bunch grasses that could live hundreds of years and native and perennial forbs. Aside from plants, grasslands are also really important for other levels of taxonomic diversity and like birds, mammals, and insects. And just a brief overview of some of these plants if you're interested. This is purple needlegrass, Stipropulchra, California oatgrass, blue wild rye, red mates, and sky lupins, and owl's clover, witch's teeth, Mariposa lilies, seaside daisies, and checker bloom. And these are just a few of the many wildflowers in California grasslands. And what about native annual grasses? California grasslands also used to have native annual grasses, but oftentimes, because the invasive species tend to be annual grasses, they've been completely displaced and oftentimes have very patchy distribution, are hard to locate, and therefore also hard to restore. Aside from the vast biodiversity that grasslands can support, they also have other ecosystem functions and services. Native grasslands have perennial bunch grasses that can live hundreds of years and potentially thousands, but there's not really great dating methods for grasses right now. These grasses are also drought and fire resistant and have roots that can grow over 16 feet deep. These deep roots can also allow the plants to go dormant over the summer if it's too dry, if they need, but it also helps contribute to soil carbon storage and sequestration deeper down in the soil column, making it more stable. The large root system can also support diverse underground life and biodiversity. Grasslands can often also occur on coastal bluffs and along steep slopes where they also help provide soil stabilization from erosion. Grasslands are also culturally important and often used by many people, maybe yourselves, for hiking, enjoying great views of expansive grasslands, searching for wildflowers, super blooms, and wildlife, and also generally a good place to just find peace. Certain grasslands are important and are still locally and traditionally used for indigenous practices in certain areas, such as San Mateo County with the Amamusin tribal band. Restoration is even increasingly being incorporated into housing developments as mitigatory practices, or sometimes even on a voluntary basis by local communities. In the second photo from the left, right here, you can see a field of Lupinus succulentus flowers, part of a grassland and vernal pool restoration project that I worked at that was embedded within a housing complex. Here and at other restoration projects, they're maintained by shared fees like homeowners associations or voluntary community fees. Coastal grasslands or coastal prairies are a small sliver of the less than 1% remaining of uninvaded grasslands in California. On the map here, you can see this thin sliver of the California coast that restored coastal grasslands encompass. You can see here that I've written potential because the shaded area here has also been partially developed. And in other areas, especially in the northern coast, grasslands also suffer from woody encroachment from sometimes native species. Although coastal prairies encompass a very small part of California grasslands, they're really important and are often thought to be one of the most diverse grassland types in all of North America. They're dominated by perennial bunch grasses and annual forbs. And what makes them unique is their coastal summertime fog that helps provide drought relief to support greater diversity and sometimes even allows perennial species to actively grow during the dry season. Coastal grasslands are also of interest because they have, as I mentioned, extraordinarily high levels of herbaceous plant diversity and potentially over 400 native forb species. The high forb diversity is often hard to restore due to lack of appropriate plant materials and insufficient knowledge, local ecological knowledge about these plants and their natural history. In combination with a desire to achieve project goals quickly, sometimes this has led to what we call the perennialization of California grasslands, where annual forbs and annual species are often left out of restoration plans. Coastal prairies are also situated in beautiful landscapes, as many of you probably know, and they are increasingly affected by land development, which can directly replace habitat for development. But land development can also cause indirect loss of coastal grasslands by increasing habitat fragmentation, changing historic disturbance patterns, and facilitating non-native and sometimes noxious species invasions. Because coastal grasslands are often located in legally designated county coastal zones, they often require compensatory or legally mandated mitigation required through the California Coastal Commission or sometimes even through local county general plans. And on the slide here, I just have a few different grasslands that I've visited over the past few years that I wanted to share with you all, just so you can see that there's such a great diversity in these grasslands. And some of them, you can't see the ocean. Others, you can see the ocean directly right there. There's more flowers in some. Others have really wide expanses. Others are situated on top of hilltops or mountains, and others are sometimes used for grazing. Although there's similarities in prairies across the state, there's also some key regional differences between these grasslands. Although the progression of a climate gradient is generally steady from north to south, California is at a pretty large state. So the northern areas are pretty far from the southern areas. So northern areas such as Humboldt and Mendocino are typically cooler and have greater annual rainfall compared to more southern areas like Santa Barbara or San Luis Obispo. Furthermore, there may be key differences in the plant communities and therefore plant selection for restoration. For example, Deschampsia cespitosa doesn't really occur much at all in Southern California, but is really common in northern coastal prairies. Whereas Hordeum brachyanthorum is much more common in southern grasslands. And due to the higher levels of ambient moisture in northern prairies, northern coastal prairies often also face issues of woody species encroachment or invasion, and often caused by native species like coyote brush, Bacchus pilularis, or even Douglas fir. Grasslands in California have been losing ground and declining for several centuries. There's often a misconception that grasslands were untouched prior to Spanish colonization, but California grasslands were actually heavily managed by indigenous tribes, including but not limited to the Chumash, Silinian, Amamutsin, Ohlone, Miwok, Pomo, Wiyot, Matul, and the Matul tribes before they were violently displaced from their lands. Traditional ecological practices often included prescribed burns, resowing native annual species, and woody species removal, which may provide the practical foundation for many of the contemporary restoration management methods we employ today. In some areas, as I mentioned previously, like in Santa Cruz and San Mateo, certain tribes like the Amamutsin are working towards relearning traditional ecological knowledge and undertaking land stewardship and restoration of grasslands. Colonization also introduced new species, some of which have now become invasive and vastly transformed ecosystems, both in grasslands and beyond. Furthermore, there's been rapid land use change ever since there's been greater population growth in the state. And this, as I mentioned previously, is leading to direct replacement of grassland habitat area, but also leading to indirect effects like habitat fragmentation. And I just wanted to show an example of a cultural burn being organized and led by the Amamutsin tribal band here, and just a couple flowers. So plant invasions are also a major issue in California grasslands, and some may argue it's actually the biggest issue because there's so many different invasive species in California and they thrive so well in California grasslands. Some of you may recognize some of these common invaders on the slides like Avena barbata, infatua, Medicago polymorpha or bird clover, Festuca bromoides and miros, also known as rat tail fescue, or false dandelions like Hippocrates. And just as I mentioned, these are only a few of the common invaders, and you may be familiar with many of the other invaders like bromus species or thistles, vetches, and many other non-native invasive species. California grasslands are deeply, can be strongly affected by invasion because it can also change the flammability and increase the fire risks of grasslands that were previously dominated by native species. This is also especially concerning with the increased frequency of fires that we're predicting, and also with soil carbon storage. Because old growth grasses, as I mentioned earlier, grasslands can live, perennial grasses can live for over hundreds of years. Old growth grasses often have the most of their root plant growth below ground. Even though they do have some plant growth above ground, most of it is below ground. Whereas in other systems like forests, trees often, yes, they have large root systems as well, but they also have a lot of their plant materials stored above ground in the woody tissue and the bark and the trunk and the branches. And so when a fire comes through, or there's a strong heat wave or a prolonged drought, there could be mass mortality events in both grasslands and forests. But the difference here is that the biomass or the plant material above ground in grasslands is much lower compared to forests. And as these large mortality events take out or kill plants, this carbon dioxide within the above ground grasses or the above ground trees will be released back to the atmosphere. And so if you think about it, trees are massive and they're much bigger than grasses. So if a fire comes through and burns up all of that material, all of that there's going to be a lot more carbon dioxide released into the atmosphere compared to with grasses. And then with grasses, as mentioned earlier, they have roots that can grow up to 16 feet deep, sometimes deeper. And this allows even if the plants die, the roots stay in the soil and help contribute to more stable and long-term carbon storage. Invasion can also affect other ecosystem functions and services through altering habitat and plant resources for other trophic levels like wildlife, mammals, insects, and birds. And in other cases, invasive nitrogen fixing species like Medicago polymorpha or bird clover can also facilitate an invasion meltdown and make an area more favorable to invasion by additional non-native species through increased nutrient availability within the local grassland. Ecological restoration, for those unfamiliar, is the act of aiding or assisting the recovery of an ecosystem. Ecological restoration involves many different management actions and sometimes is just invasive species control. but oftentimes practitioners will also plant or seed species whose populations have seemingly been drastically reduced or extirpated. In most instances, practitioners seek to restore a given area based on a nearby reference system of the same habitat type. And for coastal grasslands, for example, surveys of high quality remnant or reference habitats find that native cover often ranges from 40 to 80%, which sounds low, but it is higher than invaded grasslands typically would have. And when you think about other systems, you might think 40% native cover is low, like compared to a wetland or a forest, but just think grasslands are very open habitat and they evolved with disturbance, which is no longer here. And because of that, they're susceptible to greater biological interference like invasion. Wetlands, for example, have a strong, what we call a strong abiotic filter because they flood often. And that flooding can prevent invasion. Whereas forests, once they're established and large, forests and trees can shade out other species. And so if you ever walk through a forest, you'll probably notice that there's a lot of open space between the trees. And that's because there's a biological filter of sunlight being reduced by the trees. But in grasslands, which are relatively short-statured and again, evolved with disturbance, they are a little more open and susceptible to invasion. And because of that, they often cannot maintain as high levels of native cover. Therefore, it's also unlikely that restoration projects will be able to achieve those same levels without intensive management. So oftentimes statutory or compensatory mitigation projects, which means they're legally required by the coastal, requires that coastal grassland projects reach a native cover goal of 25 to 60%. So for me, I decided to choose a standard performance metric of 25% native cover because that's kind of like the lower end of what required legally mandated projects have. And because I'm familiar with the limited funding levels in restoration, and I've talked with a few practitioners, we often expect that invasive species can have really high cover. And in fact, the Terrestrial Vegetation Guide of California actually classifies a native grassland as just 10% native cover. And so 25% native cover is an appropriate classification based on how we classify habitats, and is a little bit higher than how we actually classify native grasslands. And before we move on, I just also want to mention that ecological restoration is a deliberate human intervention. And as such, personal identities and management decisions will vary widely across restoration projects, even of similar habitats. There's large uncertainty in restoration because restoration outcomes are unknown or variable. On the photos on the right here, you can see 3 different transects I did at one single site. And this is at Whitethorn in Humboldt in the King Range. Even from this one site, you can see how much variability there is in outcomes. Most grassland restoration projects lack funds to conduct rigorous post-implementation monitoring, which prevents them from knowing if they achieve project goals. This also means many projects are not able to apply adaptive management practices because they don't really know what's happening with their past restoration work. Projects that do have funds often are only able to monitor immediately after implementation or for a short duration. Therefore, the outcomes of projects past 5 years is pretty much unknown. Experimental restoration studies also indicate that variability in restoration is likely also influenced by the degree of environmental variability, the lack of resources for restoration, insufficient knowledge about biological interactions, and insufficient knowledge about pre-site and reference habitat conditions. Understanding historic and future environmental conditions is also important to consider when developing restoration projects. Historic disturbance regimes have been disrupted, and in some cases, it'll be necessary to restore these disturbance patterns in order to restore grasslands and maintain them. Historic disturbance regimes include prescribed burns and also grazing by large but now extinct ungulates. Although grazing is now, can also be now completed by cattle or sheep and other types of large mammals. Although it's important to remember that even though grazing can be used as a tool for restoration, unmanaged grazing can lead to grassland declines, through overgrazing and too much disturbance, which eventually will facilitate non-native grass invasion. Understanding the natural history of different species will also serve to improve the diversity of species incorporated beyond commonly used species. Natural history and local ecological knowledge can serve as a guide to select species and indicate which species will be ideal for planting in particular microhabitats or on particular years based on the climate. Interannual variability means that one year could have a lot of rain and it could be really cold, and the next year could be really hot with no rain, which means there's a lot of variation between the 2 years. And so interannual variability in California and if you've lived in California for a long time, you probably have experienced this kind of strong changes in weather patterns from one year to another. And this variability can also play a really strong role in shaping restoration outcomes and should also be considered as a factor in implementation and for management when considering what species to use and which management practices to employ. As previously mentioned, restoration is a human intervention, and as such will be directly shaped by the person or persons undertaking the restoration. It has been shown in various studies that socioeconomic and political factors play a defining role in shaping ecological outcomes, and even more so in projects with direct human interventions. For example, the surrounding parcels and their views and perspectives may influence how an agency undertakes restoration, or could potentially even limit the tools a practitioner can implement. For example, may limit the use of prescribed fire. It could also limit the use of herbicide. In other instances, a land manager's interest or influence may drive or generate restoration projects when there's supplemental or extra funds, whereas uninterested people may decide to pursue other types of conservation-related projects. Projects near agricultural operations might use similar practices or machinery as nearby farmers, whereas agencies with high staff or volunteer laborers like national parks might do large targeted hand removal events. Some may even have different species preferences or different aesthetics for landscape planning. As such, management practices greatly differ across agencies and even within the same agency across different practitioners. Accordingly, restoration project goals also will differ. Goals will also differ depending on whether the project is statutory or legally mandated, or non-statutory, meaning not legally mandated or essentially voluntary. Although traditional land stewardship from indigenous people have been occurring for several thousand years, ecological restoration was first coined as a term in practice in the 1930s, but not more popularly practiced and studied until the 1980s. Although restoration work in California specifically may have occurred earlier, it was not regularly documented until the late 80s. And this demonstrates that restoration is a relatively young conservation field and science, but even so, there's a glaring gap in the knowledge that we need to know, which is what has happened with past restoration outcomes. Because projects often lack funds, they often aren't assessed after implementation and have not yet been closely studied by many researchers. Furthermore, there's not really a standard performance metric or way to compare grassland projects across the state. In order to better understand coastal grassland restoration outcomes years later, I asked 4 questions. First, does coastal grassland restoration meet project-based goals and a standards performance metric? Second, is native cover related to project age? Third, what are the biggest barriers to achieving restoration goals? And finally, what are the common methods used by practitioners to improve native cover and richness? And before we get into it, I just want to mention this is research from my dissertation in collaboration with my PhD advisors, Dr. Karen Hole and Dr. Daniel Press. I also want to take a quick moment to thank all the restoration practitioners, land managers, researchers, student assistants, and volunteers that helped me with this project and made the work possible. I also want to thank the generous funding sources listed on the right. And again, I just want to reiterate how thankful I am for the restoration practitioners, because this work required immense collaboration and coordination and would not have been possible otherwise. So to answer the questions I previously outlined, I surveyed 36 restoration projects spanning a 1,000 kilometer gradient from Santa Barbara to Humboldt. To locate projects, I contacted universities and colleges in each of these areas to see if they could identify projects. I also contacted local land trusts and local nature reserves to see if they had completed any restoration themselves or if knew of any nearby projects. I then reached out to known contacts in restoration from my previous experience and also located local restoration agencies within each county and asked them if they had done any projects. Initially, I contacted about 150 people from this search, and which led me to talk to some more people. And eventually I contacted about 200 different folks in order to locate my 36 sites. I later learned after my first year of field surveys in 2019 that I just got a weird request. I later learned from my interviews that there may be up to 48 sites that fit the criteria that could have been surveyed. But this indicates that I surveyed about 2/3 of existing coastal grasslands within this range, known by these 200 people and the various agencies I've communicated with. Although I surveyed in 2019, 2020, and 2021, I will just be talking about results from 2019 today. Sites that were selected were at least 3 years post-implementation in 2019, were actively planted or seeded, larger than 1 acre in size, and was classified as a coastal prairie because they received summertime fog. I selected projects 3 years or older because first-year results can often vary widely because plants can experience high mortality in their first year, or in some cases, grow slow and not achieve higher cover until later years. The projects I identified range from 3 to 30 years post-implementation by 2019 and range from 1 to 32 acres. I conducted vegetation surveys from 2019 to 2021 to account for the interannual variability between years I mentioned previously. In 2019, I surveyed the original 32 sites I identified. In 2020, I could not gain access to all the sites, but I sampled 20 of the sites. In 2021, I resurveyed most of the original sites, plus 5 additional new projects identified from management surveys and interviews, totaling 34 sites for 2021. I estimated absolute plant cover of all plant species on the ground and ground cover types in 1/4 meter square quadrats every 5 meters along 50-meter transects. If you're unfamiliar with what that might look like, here is a quarter meter quadrat or a quadrat. And in this, it's probably hard to see from here, but usually I think of it like swimming. I dive my face in there and kind of separate all the grasses and identify every single species that I can possibly find. And I then estimate the relative cover of that species to the quadrat. I used a minimum of 3 transects and a maximum of 16 transects, depending on the site size. And in 2019, I also collected soil samples from each transect to characterize the site soils. Prior to conducting any of my field surveys, I also did project document analyses to determine what the goals of the projects were and the management practices and funding levels. Sorry, my cat. After conducting all the field surveys in 2019, I began to conduct semi-structured interviews with at least 1 restoration practitioner from each project. Semi-structured interviews have guiding questions, but are loosely structured so the participant can lead the discussion. Because some practitioners worked on multiple projects I surveyed, they may be linked to more than 1 project. Thus, there were less than 36 interviews. When possible, I interviewed 2 people from each project, and in total, interviewed a total of 26 practitioners. On the largest barriers to achieving restoration goals, implementation strategies, and helped fill in information for projects that had no project documents or missing information from their documents. On the results, I just want to acknowledge that what I'm presenting today is preliminary results, and what I'm sharing will encompass the 2019 plant surveys, all of the document analyses, and all of the management interviews. I'm still working to incorporate the 2020 and 2021 plant data, and I'm also actively working to analyze additional socioeconomic factors, such as funding levels and labor investment, that I won't be speaking on today, but I can answer some questions on at the end if anyone has any. Now, before we get into the results, I just want to remind everyone of this terminology in case you're not familiar, but statutory projects are legally mandated by law, whereas non-statutory projects are not mandatory, not legally required, and essentially are voluntary. Interestingly, we found that most of the restoration projects we surveyed were actually voluntary, and only 41% of the projects we surveyed were legally required as part of mitigation coastal development. And as I mentioned earlier, there were some sites that I missed, and of the projects I missed, 10 of those sites were mandatory, and 6 of those sites were voluntary. And I was able to sample most of those voluntary sites this year and some of the mandatory sites. But interestingly, some of those restoration sites that were restored on a mandatory basis specifically requested I did not come to their restoration project to survey. We also found, interestingly, that voluntary or non-mandated projects often were able to achieve higher native species cover and native species richness, but mandatory projects, or ones that were legally required, had lower non-native species cover. We found that numeric time-bound objectives were only present for 22% of the projects. And so let me just clarify that for a sec. Numeric time-bound objective would mean that there's a target to achieve a certain amount of native cover or species richness over a certain time period. For example, reaching 25% native cover after 5 years. Whereas a non-numeric directional goal would be something like increasing native cover or decreasing non-native cover. So we found that numeric time-bound objectives were only present for 22% of projects, all of which were statutory. Only one of the statutory projects did not have a numeric time-bound goal. And that statutory project likely did not have one of those numeric time-bound goals because it was the oldest one from 1993. All other statutory projects were older, such as, and happened after 2000, and all had numeric goals. The remaining 78% of projects had non-numeric directional goals. Most of these goals consisted of either improving native cover, decreasing non-native cover, erosion control, or a combination. A considerable amount of directional goals with little follow-up and also little pre-restoration data makes it really hard to evaluate project-based success in a standard way across systems and across grasslands, which is another reason why we decided to implement a standard performance metric. So before we talk a little bit more about the standard performance metric, I also want to mention that I did compare restoration success based on the original project-based goals outlined by the projects, which again varied. But we found that restoration projects, all but one restoration project surveyed, actually reached the project-based goals, which is actually a really optimistic result, because before this, practitioners and myself and other people I've spoke with also thought that restoration might be lost to invasive species in some cases. So with the standard performance metric, I just want to briefly remind you all that the standard performance metric is at least 25% native cover after 5 years and 6 native species. And so we find that the 81%, or this dark bar here, 81% of projects were successful at meeting this standard performance metric across the state. We find that 6% of projects met the species richness goal, but fell 5% short of the 25% native cover goal. And we found 4 projects, or 13% of the projects surveyed, did not meet the standards performance metric and may need further improvement in the future. Now, before we get into this next section, I just want to briefly mention that I'll be presenting a series of correlation plots. It's important to remember that the variables presented on the axes are related or correlated, but that does not necessarily mean one caused the other. We found that native cover ranged from 13 to 79% across the span of the sites surveyed. We found that native species richness also widely ranged from 5 species to 60 species at the most diverse site. We also found that native species cover stayed relatively stable with project age, with no significant decline with increasing project age. Non-native cover ranged from 24 to 96%, and non-native species richness ranged from 15 to 47 species. We did, however, find a weak correlation with non-native cover and project age, where increased project age was related to increased non-native cover. Additionally, we found that native species cover was also strongly and negatively correlated with non-native species cover, which was strongly supported by literature and the management surveys. This illustrates the importance of invasive species management and non-native species and how non-native species competition can severely impact restoration outcomes. This may also suggest that in the future, as non-native cover increases, native cover may decrease with project. This may indicate that as project age increases and non-native cover increases, native cover may decrease over time. We also found an increase in non-native species cover was related to a decrease in native species richness found per unit area. And I should have stopped earlier, but if you're not familiar with the term richness, you can think of richness as the total number of unique species or diversity in an area. So we found that non-native species cover was related to decreased native species richness. And this again further illustrates the impact of non-native species competition, not just on native cover, but also on diversity. We found that restoration practitioners were increasingly confident with the achievability of restoration goals as time progressed. Before 2005, only 10% of projects believed they could achieve restoration goals they planned for. Whereas after 2005, 68% of projects believed they could achieve the goals they set out for. This is really important because this means restoration practice is growing as a whole, and confidence is growing in confidence and adapting practices based on older projects. We also asked practitioners if they felt the surrounding community supported their restoration projects. And in 97% of projects, practitioners indicated they had community support. And this is also really important because there was, misconception that sometimes local communities don't support restoration. And this is really great because that means neighbors are at least tolerant of restoration, or in other cases, supporting restoration, which may help increase restoration efforts in the future. We also found that implementation strategies vary greatly across restoration projects. 78% of the projects surveyed took some type of baseline data, but only 50% of the projects surveyed specifically took vegetative data. Other data generally consisted of photo monitoring points to compare change, and also sometimes consisted of soil characterization or erosion tests. We then also asked practitioners whether they believed planting or seeding was better for reintroducing species to a restoration site. 31% of practitioners indicated that planting was the only and best method to use when restoring a site, whereas 69% believed that there was some trade-off with planting and seeding methods. Most commonly, the trade-offs, practitioners that indicated there were trade-offs said that they would prefer planting, but planting was not necessarily feasible for all projects. Projects that are larger may be harder to plant in entirety, but because it requires more plant material, somewhere to grow that plant material, and the time and labor to install all of that material. And so if you think about it, restoring 30 acres by planting would be much, much more difficult than restoring 1 acre by planting. Whereas seeding across 30 acres may seem more appealing, feasible, and cost-effective to some with limited budgets. In other instances, practitioners indicated that it may be best to just seed annual species because sometimes they don't grow well in containers and just need to be put into the field directly. In other instances, practitioners believe that seeding events should follow a disturbance such as a prescribed fire or a targeted weeding event that has removed a lot of the invasive biomass and cleared open space. We also found that the intensity of post-implementation maintenance varied widely across restoration projects. 31% of projects had high maintenance, 50% had low maintenance, and 19% had no post-restoration maintenance. Low maintenance means they did one single targeted weeding event or they had annual mowing and grazing management. High maintenance means they did multiple targeted weeding events throughout the year and also had replanting efforts. We found that there were 3 common barriers to achieving restoration project goals. Similar to the ecological data, practitioners from all projects indicated that invasive species management was the largest barrier to achieving project goals. We found that 84% of projects also indicated that insufficient funding was a barrier to achieving project goals or the quality they wish to achieve. From the 27 projects that indicated insufficient funding, 74% of these projects indicated they would have conducted post-restoration monitoring to apply adaptive management if they had the resources. 33% of projects also indicated they had difficulty sourcing enough appropriate plant material, which could have been caused by a restriction in planting genetics or insufficient knowledge about species natural history to know where to collect restoration species. Restoration practitioners indicated the ideal management action to improve native cover was to undertake targeted weed removal. Practitioners also indicated supplemental watering can be useful in improving native cover, especially for container plants in more arid areas. In fact, supplemental watering was only suggested for southern and central coast sites and not at all for northern coast sites. 19% of the projects also indicated that local genetics were important for improving native cover. However, use of local genetics was controversial between practitioners. About half of practitioners believed that using local genetics was important for improving restoration outcomes in some way, whereas the other half of practitioners believed using local genetics was an unnecessarily restrictive measure that drove up plant sourcing costs, and in some cases made it harder to incorporate more diverse species palettes. And 13% of projects also indicated that reestablishing historic disturbance regimes or using pre-site preparation treatment could also help improve native cover. Practitioners indicated that the strategy to improve native species richness differed from native cover. Most practitioners believed that reestablishing historic disturbance patterns through prescribed fires was the most ideal way to bring back native species richness. And here's an example of practitioners in Humboldt actually doing a prescribed fire using pile burns and then seeding the I guess burned area afterwards with annual forb seeds and some perennials. And anecdotally, it's been shown to be working pretty well. Some also indicated that targeted mowing or grazing with litter removal could be feasible where fire is not. 53% of the projects also indicated starting with a larger species palette to start with would help increase the final species richness. 13% of projects also indicated targeted weeding could help. One of the really interesting and important findings from this project was that we found coastal prairie restoration may be causing regional biotic homogenization because 88% of the restoration practitioners across the entire span of restored coastal grasslands are using the same 8 key species because they believe they either grow better they either have better survival or can grow faster to help meet project goals. In other words, at a regional scale, species may be becoming more similar. In this table, we can see the frequency each species is used across the 36 projects, where green columns represent northern sites north of the Golden Gate Bridge, blue columns represent central coast sites south of the bridge, north of San Luis Obispo, and orange sites represent southern sites, San Luis Obispo and Santa Barbara. And as mentioned, some practitioners restored more than one project, which is why there are less than 36 columns. It's also notable that species that were commonly used were perennial grass species, except for Achillea millefolium, which is a circumboreal form found commonly in many habitats. Although usage slightly differed between regions, such as Hordeum brachyantherum being preferentially used in the southern and central coast sites, and Danthonia californica, Stuca rubra, and Deschampsia cespisota being more commonly used in the northern coast sites. This preferential use of bunch grasses is likely leading to the perennialization of California grasslands, as noted in a previous study, and potentially leading to loss of rarer annual species at a regional level as we continue to lose rare grassland habitat, but not necessarily restore the full complement or the full suite of species. So overall, we found that grassland restoration was largely successful at reaching project-based goals and at achieving a standard performance metric. Although projects were successful at reaching native cover goals and restoring some native species richness, Results indicate that the full complement of species is not always, the full complement of species regionally is not always being restored. These findings were also exciting and surprising because me and my advisors and practitioners I spoke with mostly thought that grassland restoration was being lost to invasive species. However, as indicated with the vegetation surveys and management interviews, there are still issues with invasive species because they were indicated as the biggest barrier to success. Most projects also indicated that they would have done, even though they achieved their project-based goals, they would have ideally worked more on their project to increase habitat quality if they had sufficient resources. So difficulty in restoring the full complement of species available may be caused by several factors. First, similar to what Lesage, Press, and Hull found with endangered species introductions, risk-averse practitioners may be unlikely to work with particular species that are hard to select because they'll be straining on their already limited budget. But also it will make it hard to achieve project goals in some cases. Some annual species have specific disturbance germination cues or only do well in certain rain years, which may also cause a project not to reach project-based goals in certain years. Aside from limited budgets to source local materials, sometimes rare species only produce seeds in large amounts on certain years, further making them inaccessible and unusable for restoration. So what about drought? We know drought will affect restoration, but how? So from some of my previous work, which I won't go into too much detail today, we have found that certain plant traits can indicate which plants will have a greater risk of death during drought. We also know that there will be trade-offs in these plant traits during development that help plants balance survival during drought and competition. And although we've found that selecting key plant traits can improve restoration establishment and survival, especially during drought, future restoration practice will need to consider these methods because they'll need to consider how to balance plant selection and potentially resulting regional biotic homogenization. Interviews already indicate that practitioners are selecting species that are competitive and survive well. Therefore, further selection for species that have high survival based on traits may exacerbate this issue of regional biotic homogenization and species loss. Some potential suggestions we have that arise from the study are as follows. First, we believe restoration projects should do their best to include additional native annual forb species and annual grass species and regionally rare species when possible, although we do acknowledge that restoration efforts are often fund limited and may make that unfeasible sometimes. This could also be addressed from a statutory standpoint or a legal standpoint by increasing the number of native species required in a restoration plan. Maybe not all of the species required in that restoration plan need to be present in the monitoring efforts years later, but then at least we can say that we introduced those species into the seed bank, and hopefully when the conditions are right, they may germinate. When possible, practitioners should not only necessarily think about including annual forbs, but also think about their regional and general rarity, and especially try to incorporate rarer species. Although planting is preferred by most practitioners, it's often indicated as infeasible due to required resource investment. One suggestion is potentially to plant container plants first, since they do well and can survive stress. And then when a disturbance comes through, or when an agency or practitioner is able to implement greater targeted removal, maybe then you will utilize that opportunity and open space and invasive species biomass removal to directly seed and basically capitalize on that open space, similar to kind of what that burn pile was doing I showed you earlier. With that, I want to thank you all again for joining me for my talk and making it this far. And I welcome any questions in the chat or verbally, or you can also reach me via email if you want to talk later. Thank you.
Hi, Justin. Thanks for the great talk. I have a question if now is an okay time. Is it okay for me to ask now, everyone? Yeah? Perfect. Okay. My question is, I'm just curious, since you collected so much data from all over the state and so many projects. I'm curious if you had like enough data between planted sites versus seeded sites to do any analysis on that you didn't talk about today.
Sorry, that's a great question. I potentially do have enough sites for that. My main concern with that type of analysis is just that they're kind of located in regionally different places. So for example, I know some of the sites in, one of the sites in Humboldt was planted and one of the sites in Humboldt was seeded. So that is really useful. But in many other areas, there's not necessarily always a matching pair in a sense, if that makes sense. So it's kind of hard to assess specifically whether seeding or planting efforts will, with strong statistical power, whether one or the other has greater influence on native cover. But I guess in a qualitative survey, summary type of way, I will be kind of summarizing that data based on my management interviews and kind of just indicate that that certain projects may. So but I haven't done that analysis yet, so I can't really answer it further. Based on the initial look of the data, it doesn't really seem to be a strong difference.
Thank you.
I have a question about one of the slides you showed towards the end of your talk about which, it looked like which photosynthetic pathways were more or less impacted by drought.
Is this it? Or?
Yes, that's it. Is there, where can I get my hands on that particular information?
So this is a illustrated feature in the California Native Grasslands journal called Grasslands. And I have a copy of it that I can send to you if you want to send me an email. I'm not 100% sure where it's accessible online at this point. I don't know if it's posted. It's available to members through our subscription newsletter, but yeah. And then this other one on the left-hand side is something I'm currently working on with a student at UC Santa Cruz, and it's not out there yet, but hopefully eventually we'll also probably go into Grasslands or something.
So which issue of the Grasslands publication would it be in?
I will have to check. I don't know off the top of my head.
Okay, thank you.
Yes. But yeah, this is a 4-page illustrated summary of some of those concepts.
Well, thank you so much, Justin. I'm going to scroll back to the top of the chats and start with a question from Alan. Alan Tong. He was very interested if you could maybe name any coastal prairies in the Sonoma or Marin counties.
Yeah, sure. So I was telling Alan earlier that in Marin especially, there's a lot of great coastal prairies. The Golden Gate National Recreational Area actually, I wouldn't say curates, but they have a large amount of coastal prairies that are really diverse, especially in April. I recommend everyone checking it out. It's beautiful, there's amazing views, and they have so many different kinds. And the cool thing there is that they have restoration efforts. They also have remnant grasslands that they've been trying to protect too. And they also have a lot of volunteer efforts. So if you live in that local area, you can also work with them to help restore some coastal prairie if that's something you're interested in too. In Sonoma, there's some great coastal prairies in Bodega Bay, especially. There's also some near Jenner and kind of north of that area along the coast. I'm blanking on the exact names of some of these areas north of Jenner, but they're there as well. There's also, my study site was actually in Occidental, which is a little more inland at the Occidental Arts and Ecology Center. And that's a really cool place too, that you can have a little weekend there, and they have a really cool back, like a restoration area in the back, which I don't think is necessarily always open to everyone, but if you mention it to them, like they'd be open to showing it to you, mostly because not many people that come there necessarily know about the restoration either. But those are a few places.
Okay, so Robin Mitchell was asking if it's possible to get a copy of your paper once complete.
Yes, I actually keep a running list of people that are interested, practitioners and others that are non-academics. And if you want to send me an email, I can easily add you to that list. And anytime I get updates or new things come out, I usually will send it to the list, including any articles I publish, illustrated artworks. I also sometimes do video summaries of my research on YouTube, which I send out. And yeah, so if you want to just send me a brief email, just letting me know that you're interested, I can add you to my list.
Okay. Susan Marshall, I believe retired soils professor at HSU, was asking, what did you hope to observe from taking soil samples, and what analysis did you do?
Yeah, so with the soil samples, I wanted to do a base characterization of soil texture at first, just to make sure that nothing varied way like that too much. And then the other thing I was also interested in was soil nutrients and nutrient availability, which I didn't present on today, but I have done some analyses. And one thing that we found was actually really interesting was that higher soil nitrogen content was related to or correlated to higher native species cover, and low nitrogen, and soil nitrogen was negatively correlated with invasive species, which is kind of opposite of what we would expect based on the literature and past work. But yeah, so that was one, and I'm still working on teasing out the reasoning behind that a little bit more. But I'm also happy to take any thoughts on that too.
Great.
Was that, were you looking at plant available nitrogen, or were you looking at total
I was looking
nitrogen?
at plant available nitrogen. Typically the type of nitrogen that's available through like agricultural nitrogen tests.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
All right. And Cal Ralph was wondering if you could tell us about any favorite coastal prairies here in Humboldt or Del Norte County.
Yeah. Well, I think my favorite probably is at Prosper Ridge in Petrolia, California. It's just like a really beautiful site. I really like the giant piles they have that they burn, which I showed you an image of. Well, you guys might not remember, but I showed an image of a pile burn earlier, and they use those to restore wildflowers. And they have a lot of really cool wildflowers up there, and it's really diverse. And it's on BLM land, which means you can camp anywhere, which is also really cool in my opinion. And so I think that is my favorite in Humboldt, and well, in the area. And yeah.
Was that Veronica Yates' photo, perhaps?
Yeah, that was the photo from Veronica Yates. That was from Prosper Ridge in Petrolia, California. And Paradise Ridge is actually really beautiful too, near Whitethorn. But the only issue I have with that site is that there's often people shooting guns, which is okay, but like I'm out there while I'm monitoring out there while they're shooting guns, and you know, I just don't want to get hit by recoil or anything.
Yep. We have some issues with that locally at our one of our favorite botanical hotspots here, Horse Mountain.
Oh yeah. Oh.
Okay, so Susan Forsall is asking if there's a difference between coastal prairies and coastal grasslands.
Not really. They are mostly the same. Some people have a distinction between them, but for our cases, in my instance, I'm mostly considering coastal prairie and grassland the same. The main distinction between coastal prairies and grasslands is coastal prairies are often thought to be, and it depends on who you talk to, there's a kind of like a debate in this topic, but coastal prairies often are thought to be more of a central coast and north coast thing, where they not only receive coastal fog, but they're also dominated by Danthonia californica, California oatgrass. That's not very common anymore in the South, because I think Danthonia requires water. And something interesting is that people in the northern coast sites actually indicated they used Xanthonia preferentially because they thought they were hardy species. But down south and in central coast sites, they indicated they wanted to use Xanthonia, but they never could get it to establish well. So that might have to do with changing climate and drier conditions. But yeah, generally coastal prairies and coastal grasslands are, they're very similar and sometimes can be used synonymously, but there is sometimes a slight distinction there.
All right, and next, Carolyn is curious about the soil samples that you took and what did you measure and how will you be using that data?
Yeah, so for the soil data, first I did in-house texture analysis, and then I also did soil carbon content analysis, but because it's collected from the top layer and there's a lot of variability in soil carbon, it's not very, I didn't really sample sufficiently for assessing soil carbon. So what I'm really looking at now is levels of micronutrients and macronutrients. So I was specifically tuned in on micronutrients based on what another practitioner told me. And, but I haven't really found a strong result related to that. And so what I'm doing with that data is I have an average soil nutrient content concentration of NPK, available NPK at each site. I also have available micronutrients like zinc, manganese, sulfur, etc. And I'm basically running correlations with those nutrient contents across the sites to see whether or not there's any relationship between the nutrient content of these different types of elements and native species cover, native species richness, or non-native species cover.
If I could add on to my question, Justin, did you consider looking at any of the biology in the soil and looking at what organisms are there and measuring their volume or mass?
Yes, I did consider that, but my advisors really wanted me to not propose too much, because originally I proposed they're doing 32 sites and they thought that was too much already. And I ended up doing all 32 sites and now I have 36 sites. And originally I did want to actually also look at microbial communities and fungal communities and their relative abundance and thinking about how that might also affect ecosystem functioning, but maybe in a future project.
Thank you.
Great, and I think Diana posted in the group chat the illustrated article that Donna Wilder Earth was interested in from your talk. There's a link to everyone in the group chat.
Oh, great, thank you, Diana. Yeah, I mean, since Diana just posted that, I just want to make a brief mention. I am a part of the California Native Grasslands Association board, and I just wanted to mention a couple of things that folks here might be interested in. First off, we have a mailing list, and you don't need to be a member to join the mailing list. You could subscribe if you'd like on cnga.org, and you can find out about all the cool events that we have at CNGA and all the different educational events we also do. Coming up soon too, we also have a couple of events. Let me just pull up the dates real quick. We're going to have a Grassland Symposium this next spring from May 20th to May 22nd in Santa Rosa at Pepperwood Preserve. So you can keep your eye out for that. There will be limited registration since of COVID. And then we also will have, and at that, we will have things like presentations, field trips, and grass identification. Yeah, I just wanted to mention those couple things, but if there's more questions, we could also answer questions too.
Sure, yes, we certainly got a few more. So Gail and Bill Eastwood mentioned that they care for about 150 acres of grassland, a bit inland from Whitethorn. Over 50 years, they've seen native grasses returning. 3 native species that predominate are Elmus glaucus, Xanthonia californica, and sorry, there's a lot of typos I'm trying to improvise. I think it's Stipa pulchra, maybe. The only restoration practice we're doing is removal of the invasive non-native tree species. Would you suggest anything beyond that? I think is what they're getting at.
Yeah, so my study specifically is looking at projects that planted or seeded, because I'm really interested in kind of reintroducing species and diversity. Although I haven't done work directly on this, and I have been told by folks at Bodega Bay Marine Reserve, for example, that they didn't need to do any planting or seeding because they just did invasive species removal, and they did dedicated invasive species removal for about 5 years. And then they started to see the native prairie return on its own, including form diversity. So if that's all you have, I think that's great. And I think one thing to think about if you have the capability is just if you can potentially maybe introduce some rare species. As I was mentioning, restoration, because of their limited budgets, often are not able to use rarer annual species. So having those species in your area could kind of help kind of prevent or mitigate for potential losses in the future too. So that's one thing you could potentially do, but I mean, just managing the grassland in that way is also great.
Great. Okay, so next, Jordan is interested if you've looked at the role or historic legacy of grazing as a potential predictor for the native/non-native cover.
I'm sorry. I'm sure this is not very standard, but I drank a lot of coffee before this, and I really need to run to the bathroom before I answer more questions, if that's okay.
I'll go after you.
Okay.
I know he did mention a lot of native ungulates extinct in native grasslands that would have been beneficial to the area. And then now a lot of that role has been filled with cattle as a grazing aspect. Trying to think of some of the coastal prairies I love around here. Of course, Bald Hills, I would assume that's a famous coastal prairie. What do you think?
Yeah, Bald Hills counts. If you want to hear more about that, come to our January evening program where Leonel Arguello from the National Redwood National and State Parks is going to talk about restoration in those parks. And one of the places they've restored or worked on restoration is the prairies along Bald Hills Road. How about if we have Jordan Mayer tell us why he's asking that question? What does he have in mind? Jordan, are you there?
Hi, Carol, I am, yes. I'm just thinking about, in particular, you know, I can't help but, oh, wow, I got a COVID virus background. I haven't even seen this in a while. I'm just thinking in particular, you know, we have our native grasslands that are, you know, have been ranched for decades, maybe first with sheep and then with cattle, and you have conifer encroachment. But I'm just wondering, you know, like that must set a trajectory that when a restoration practice goes into effect, you know, that might drastically affect the results, the compaction of the soil in particular, not necessarily just selective grazing of more tasty species, but the impacts on the soil density. And I'm just wondering, you know, if Justin, great talk, by the way, hope you're relieved now.
Thank you. Yes. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just, Carol just put me on the spot about that. My question about like grazing. Yeah. Like
so yeah, I personally, I am going to be looking more closely also at key management factors. But right now I haven't yet looked at the role of grazing at these sites compared to other disturbances or other types of management practices. It is, yeah, it's true. Grazing is used historically, but yeah, your point is totally valid. trampling and soil disturbance and compaction can also impact the native grasslands. And a lot of, I mean, as I mentioned previously, grasslands were grazed by ungulates, similar to cattle and cows, or sorry, cattle and goats and sheep and stuff, but they're now extinct. And so some of that, this level of disturbance is okay, and but often not at early stages in restoration. And also kind of just letting out cattle loose on a field doesn't really work well either. It really needs to be more targeted, or yeah, it needs to be targeted and kind of rotational grazing. And past studies have generally found that high intensity rotational grazing often can be really effective, but oftentimes that's really costly to implement. And so practitioners and ranchers often prefer not to do so. I'm not sure if that answers your question or if that was getting at something else, but I can clarify further too.
Well, I guess, you know, I think that addresses it. Yeah. And you know, a big difference might be our coastal prairies, like what you're talking about, you know, would have been grazed by different sorts of species and different sorts of domesticated species after the natives than maybe like our slightly inland coastal grasslands that would have been more, you know, sheep grazing and cattle grazing. So it's probably different to the coastal and intermontane grasslands, like which species were there and what those effects might have been.
Yeah, definitely. And that's a good point. I don't really do much work right now on interior grasslands, so I couldn't necessarily speak to the difference between those.
All right, so Mark has a question. He notes that 25% seems like rather a low bar for gauging success. How was that standard chosen?
Yeah, and I totally understand that concern. 25% does seem low compared to other systems, I'm sure. But as I mentioned, coastal grasslands in general often are really susceptible to invasion compared to other systems that have other types of strong, in a sense, what we call filters that kind of limit invasion. So like wetlands, for example, have flooding, and forests, for example, have intense shading, whereas grasslands used to have disturbance like fire, but that's now been removed. And so the species that required that to be maintained often don't have that anymore. And for example, some species require fire to germinate. And so without that disturbance, these kinds of, in a sense, niches or kind of specializations by plants are left open and make the system more susceptible to invasion. And then furthermore, we've also done, not me personally, but other botanists in the area have surveyed remnant, so that's existing native grasslands in the area. And oftentimes they actually only find that at the very best instance, in one instance, the remnant grassland reaches 80% native cover. In almost all other instances, it falls around 40% cover, sometimes up to 60, but ranges more between 40 and 60. And so in thinking about that, that's like an existing native grassland that hasn't been massively transformed. With restored grasslands, there's been a lot of different land factors that have been adjusted. There could have been tilling, which strongly affects soil structure and soil communities and resulting plant communities. And so it's, in a sense, it's sometimes, I mean, I guess it depends on your perspective, but in my perspective, it's because I also used to practice restoration. It's a little it's unfeasible really to kind of expect restoration to achieve grassland restoration to achieve the exact same levels of remnant sites. And so if remnant sites are only reaching 40 to 80% native cover, it'll probably be pretty hard for native sites to also achieve 40% native cover because, like I said, there used to be disturbance. And to maintain that, we have to literally continuously weed all the time. When I used to work in restoration, even at higher levels, 70% of my job was weeding invasive grasses all day. And we had teams of like 4 or 5 people. And we literally just weed, and that wasn't even a large site. It was only like a 10-acre site. And we would literally just weed all the time. And so I know that that's probably not necessarily a satisfying answer, but the main reason is because it's not really, in my opinion, and the opinion of other practitioners I've spoken to, really reasonable to expect restoration to restore an extremely degraded, transformed habitat to a level that has not really been transformed, to a system that hasn't really been transformed in such a way. And then further, compliance projects, which are those that are legally required by government agencies, often require native cover goals ranging from 25 to 60% native cover. And so we decided to select the lowest end of that just because we didn't really know. Yeah, we just decided to select the lowest end of that because, like I said, we haven't surveyed other grasslands in other areas. And so I can't necessarily say that they're able to achieve similar cover. From anecdotal data, from interviews from practitioners, remnant grasslands in other areas outside of the one I surveyed or without I know has been surveyed, they also indicate native cover generally isn't more than like 50% of these grasslands. So I hope that can help answer or alleviate some of your concerns, but I do realize that that's not necessarily maybe satisfying.
All right, so the next question I'm going to ask both you and Carol. Melinda is asking, does CMPS or perhaps another agency you know of provide a service to identify grasses for landowners as a service? They have a small prairie, but they don't know of all the species that may be of concern.
Well, I'm not sure. Yeah, you
well,
want to go first, Kate?
Yeah, I can say that the way I learned grasses, well, I went on a grass walk with Melissa Brooks a long time ago. But the way I really learned them was to have a fellow from the county ag office come walk around our pasture with me, and he knew the grasses. So as he identified them, I collected them and made stickers to go on them. So I learned them from this guy at the county ag office, and there, you know, every county ag office might have somebody who knows grasses and could do this for you. And then as far as our native plant consultation service goes for our chapter, we have one person, well, I know the common ones, the ones that are in my pasture, I can identify those. And then we have somebody else who's one of our consultants who does know the less common grasses as well. So if we can get him to go, then we can identify your grasses. It would be fun to see your prairie.
Yeah, I'll also reiterate what Carol said. Like, I didn't know, like, I didn't specialize in grasses or anything before I started studying grasslands. I did restoration of grasslands, and I could identify common grassland species through first learning, sorry, I'm not saying this right. I learned it through word of mouth, essentially, by walking through restoration practitioners that knew the grasses. CNGA does offer grass identification courses, but they don't necessarily offer, I don't think necessarily there's someone that will be able to come out and identify for you. Locally, you might consider asking a graduate student, such as myself, not me, but in your area, if they have maybe someone from like Carrie Burns, I'm not sure if she's still here, but she works with students from botany. And so maybe someone there might know how to identify grasses, and that's a good opportunity for them too. And that could help you out. And I do stuff like that in my local area. And that's really been beneficial for me too. But yeah, I think the easiest way is probably to find a consultant if you can't find any other services.
Great. And the last question we have is from Carol. Carol, do you want to ask your last question? About sweet vernal grass?
Oh, okay. One of our botanists up here who worked a lot in the Fort Bragg area and up here in Eureka, Arcata area, said that sweet vernal grass was taking over all our coastal prairies. And that was that. Is that what you saw happening?
I mean, I wouldn't say yes, there are invasive species that is becoming an increasing problem in the northern coast. I wouldn't necessarily say they're taking it over completely. I think perennial bunch grasses are pretty competitive and can hold their own ground unless something comes along and knocks them out. But you know, there's also other invasive species that are super common that are a major issue as well. It also along with that anthoxanthum. But yes, there is a lot of that anthoxanthum in Mendocino and in Humboldt, and actually also even in northern Sonoma, it's starting to become a problem too. So yes. Well, I mean, not exactly yes, but mostly yes. And then I guess, I'm not sure what your other question was, restoration. Yeah, I'm not sure if you wanted to clarify the other question. I'm not 100%.
Well, the other one was, this was something I read in the magazine that Cal IPSI puts out, California Invasive Plant Council, where they interviewed a fellow who restored grasslands by going in and first finding what you had there that was native, and then using that as a nucleus to work out from. And the work he did was very targeted weed eating. So instead of getting down on hands and knees and pulling things, he would use his weed eater. And then the other important thing was to take lots of soil samples to find out what your soil had. And then there were certain nutrients that native grasses really needed for the seedlings to get established. So one reason you often see a place with some native grasses, but they don't spread, is that the soil is lacking in these particular nutrients that they need. And so you find that out, and then you add those to give the seedling native grasses a boost.
Yeah, and I actually have I think I know exactly who and where you're talking about. I will, and that's actually one of the reasons why I took soil samples to start with, to kind of see, is there a difference in these micronutrients across these grasslands? And maybe I didn't have large enough sample size, but in my case, I didn't really find a strong effect of micronutrients. In terms of the weed eating, I do agree that it could be an effective method, but I think I know who you're talking about. The main issue with this method for restoration practice as a whole is that it's an extremely cost-intensive method. It requires, I'm pretty sure they do weed eating once a week, maybe during the weekends from what I hear, and with a crew of a couple of people. And so most of the times, restoration efforts don't have necessarily enough funds for that, and definitely won't have enough funds for repeated soil testing. So I think that's one of the main limiting, that's probably what I would say the limiting factor for that method. Although I do agree that it could potentially be a great method for introducing species where you have a lot of labor possible, like in a home garden potentially. And like a lot of these, and I'll mention too, like a lot of those projects that use this method are often funded through private development or on private property. So these areas often can put a lot of money into this restoration effort, and so it does work really well. But as mentioned, or as other people have experienced, restoration is often very fund limited, and so it's really hard to get enough money to do efforts like that if it's not on like private property.
Good insights.
Yeah, thank you for the questions.
Well, that's all the questions I see in the feed, but there are several thank yous for your program and all the wonderful information you shared with us. And thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It was great speaking.
Yes, thank you, Justin. And thank you for all your good questions and people like Gail and Bill who have shared about their grassland. And I'm wondering what the grassland is that Henry has as his background picture. Do you want to tell us, Henry?
That's Bolinas Lagoon, and this is the land between Bolinas and Stinson. And it's like mostly invaded, but yeah.
Oh, that's right over there. Called Bolinas, Fairfax.
So Marin County, there it is. Great. Okay.
Okay, well, I hope everyone has a great evening.
Okay, yes.
Yeah,
thank you, Justin. Yeah. And good night, everybody.
Good night, everyone.